All right, well, we are in 2 Samuel chapter 5 this morning in our Bible class. And, does anybody not have the question handouts? Show of hands. Up. She did not get the question handouts, but I'm not giving her any after she's going to act like that. Anybody? Do you all need question handouts? Or? Okay, yeah. That's my last one anyway, so I'll have to make more before the next class. No worries. All right. 2 Samuel 5, and we left off last time with David's battle against the Philistines. So in 2 Samuel chapter 5, we're going to pick up in verse 17. Man. 2 Samuel chapter 5. Can I get two people volunteer to read for me? Anybody show hands who wants to read? Nobody wants to read this morning. Keith? Okay. Keith, you'll read verses 17 through 21, and who wants to be the second reader? Ruth, you can read verses 22 through 25. Yes.
Now the Philistines heard that they had anointed David king over Israel.
All right, so we have two battles against the Philistines. And what do the Philistines do differently in the second battle from the first battle? What do they do differently? No, it doesn't. Verses 18 and 22, they do exactly the same thing, don't they? They don't do anything different. No. If the answer is nothing, that's correct. The Philistines do absolutely nothing different from the first battle to the second. In both instances, they decide to attack David, and they go to the valley of Rephaim, and they camp against David. And so if the Philistines do things exactly the same, would you expect God to give the exact same instructions both times? Maybe, maybe not. See, we shouldn't presume to speak for God. The first time they have a battle, David inquires of God, and God gives him a strategy, and he employs it. And the second time, David might have been tempted to go, well, I already know what God said last time. We've already figured out what God thinks. Let's just do what we did before. Would that have worked? Don says no. That's right. It would not have worked because the Lord gives a completely different strategy. Don, yes, you have something. Yes. And this is a big deal. For David's character, he's the one who's he's constantly inquiring of the Lord everywhere that we see him. Now, the Philistines, of course, and this is, I think, more evidence that the text is not giving us the story in chronological order. Because it's unlikely that the Philistines would have waited for David to capture Jerusalem and have a bunch of children before deciding to attack him. when they heard that David had been anointed king in verse 17. What happens, rather, is they hear that he's been anointed king and they decide to attack. A unified Israel is bad for them. But God gives a strategy. He says, go up. And David defeats the Philistines at a place called Baal Perizzim, which means master of breakthrough. He breaks through the Philistines. The victory over the Philistines fulfills Abner's words from chapter 3 and verse 18. Well, which Abner was quoting the word of the Lord in that instance. By the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines, from the hand of all their enemies. Now we're going to see a similar breakthrough that God makes in chapter 6 as well. And in verse 21, we learn that the Philistine idols get carried off, which is kind of an implicit jab at the whole concept of idolatry, isn't it? The idols couldn't carry the Philistines, so guess who gets carried off instead? Well, the idols do. There's a similar joke that Isaiah makes about that in Isaiah 46. He describes the idols that Israel expected to carry them, and they bow down and they're carried off into captivity by the Babylonians. And God says, I don't know why you've been worshiping these idols who get carried off when I'm the one who's carried you since the beginning. He kind of makes a little wordplay on that in Isaiah 46. Well, now we get down to 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles, the parallel account in 1 Chronicles 14 adds the detail that the idols were actually burned with fire. In verse 12 of chapter 14 of 1 Chronicles, it says they abandoned their gods there. David gave the order, and they were burned with fire. There's another sign that the idols were unable to save. And the second victory of the Philistines the second victory against the Philistines at Rephaim, they come to the valley. David inquires of God. God gives a completely different strategy. Don't go up. Instead, circle around. The Philistines do nothing different, and yet God's instructions are different. So I think that there's a lesson here. We should never presume that we know God so well that we stop consulting Him. That's the bottom line for all of us. We should never presume that we know what He has said so well that we stop consulting the Scriptures. We know what the Bible teaches about this. We're not going to cross-check it against anything else, are we? Well, always should be searching the Scriptures to see whether the things are so. Yes, Mark?
Earlier, I highly analyzed the first battle. It appears that David is up front against the Philistines. They went to the same battleground, probably a good place to battle. And so they were probably expecting David to fight the same way, but this time God said, circle around behind them and wait.
Okay.
And when I make them think you're attacking them, I'm marching in the mulberry, that would probably be in front of the Philistines, up and attack them from the rear.
Okay.
So, in other words, the Philistines probably thought they had David's strategy all figured out. We know how to counter it now.
Okay.
And so then David does something.
Okay. Well, based on that, reword the question. What does the Bible tell us the Philistines did differently? Nothing, exactly. And from David's perspective, it may have looked that way too. So, Don. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Always cross-check what you believe and what people tell you, what the Scriptures say. That's true of everybody. That's true of me too. You don't take my word for it. Go look at the Scriptures and see what it says. Now, okay, it says he struck them down from Geba to Gezer. The parallel account in Chronicles had Gibeon instead of Geba. They might just simply be alternate spellings of one another, or they were proximate cities. Whatever the case. Geba was the place where Saul and Jonathan won their first battle against the Philistines in 1 Samuel 13 and 14. And here, David inquires of... If you remember what happened when Saul fought the Philistines at that location in 1 Samuel 13 and 14, he fails to inquire of God. He brings the ark in, but before he has the word from the Lord, he sees what's going on with Jonathan. He says to the priest, stay your hand. We're going to go and fight this battle anyway. And they don't inquire of the Lord. And then later on, of course, when he does inquire of the Lord, The Lord doesn't answer him. That's in 1 Samuel 14. Well, here David wins a victory and inquires of God in the place where Saul once failed to inquire of God. So that's another thing here. What did the battle scenes here, what did they teach us about God's character? Okay, good. Yeah, that's good. What else do they teach us? He's faithful to what he says. Okay. Gail. He expects to be consulted. All right. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different points I think we could just make about who God is from any text of the Bible. One thing I was struck by is that God is, people have this idea that God is like this big plush teddy bear that they can, give hugs to and have rainbows and cookies. That's not really the point here. God is described as the master of breakthrough. The Lord has broken through my enemies in verse 20. And he's described as the striker in verse 24. The Lord will have gone out before you to strike the army of the Philistines. God is the breaker and the striker. God is not to be trifled with. He is a warrior. He is described, as the psalmist says in Psalm 24 verse 8, mighty in battle. The kingdom of God isn't established without the shedding of blood. There's a lesson in that too. Now, ultimately, of course, whose blood sheds establishes the true kingdom of God? Jesus Christ, exactly. But then there's also the principle that we see, like in Psalm 2, for instance, that God's servants don't gain victory unless those who oppress them and who defy His anointed one are broken with the rod of iron. Keith, do you have something? Yes. Yes. Yes, that's good. All right, and there's a lot more I think that could be said. Does anybody else have anything they want to add here, or comments, or questions, or just things you noticed? All right, well, we'll move on to chapter 6 then. In chapter 6, we have the movement of the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. And let's go ahead, and does somebody want to read the first 5 verses for me? All right. Well, I guess before we even talk about the movement of the ark, let's ask ourselves a more basic question. What was the ark? What was it for? Don. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Right, okay, yeah, it's representative of the presence of the Lord. According to Hebrews 9, it contained 3 things: the tablets of the stone tablets of the 10 Commandments, a golden jar of manna, and the rod of Aaron that budded. And so that's, but it is definitely associated with God's presence. Numbers chapter 10, whenever the ark is taken up, Moses would sing this song, "Rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered." Now, that later became the basis for Psalm 68. And then whenever the ark was set down in the resting place, Moses would sing, "Return, O Lord, to the myriad thousands of Israel." Now the ark was associated with God's presence. It had a kingly function. It's described as the footstool of God in 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 2. Jeremiah describes it as the throne of God in Jeremiah 3 and verses 16 and 17. And all these major texts in Samuel that mention the ark, there's two places in Samuel that mention the ark. One is in 1 Samuel, and starting in chapter 4. And the other one is here in 2 Samuel chapter 6. And in both of those places, it mentions the fact that the Lord of hosts was enthroned above the cherubim. What were the cherubim? They were carved on top of the ark. These angelic figures, they had wings. But the Lord is said to have been enthroned above it. When Aaron would enter the most holy place on the Day of Atonement, the Lord would appear in the cloud above the cherubim of the ark. The ark was kind of like God's footstool. The ark also had a prophetic function because it was the place where people would go to inquire of God. It was also the place where the Word of God was stored and where the book of the law was kept, according to Deuteronomy 31. And it also had a priestly function. What was one thing that the ark was used for on a regular basis? Every year, what did they do with the ark? They would have a sacrifice of atonement. And they had the two goats that they would kill. They had two goats. One would be killed, and the other would be banished to the wilderness. Mishnaic tradition says it was thrown off a cliff, so it was killed too. But the law does not say to kill it. But the one goat they would slaughter, and they would sprinkle the blood on the Ark of the Covenant as a way of atoning for the sins of the people and the defilement of the sanctuary. The Ark itself is, a type of Christ. It's a symbol of God's. Christ himself is the real presence of God among us. He is our king, our prophet, our priest, and the ark was even anointed. So there's a sense in which the ark was a, quote, Messiah of sorts. Exodus 30 verse 26 says that the ark was anointed. And, in a lot of places the ark was also brought into battle. For instance, whenever they captured the city of Jericho, the Ark of the Covenant was right there. They marched it around the city multiple times. You see that in various places. It was also in 2 Samuel 11, we learned that it was in the battle against Ammon. Whenever David's trying to get Uriah to go down to his wife, Uriah makes the comment, he says that all the troops are in their tents, Joab is in his tents, even the Ark of God is sitting in a tent on the battlefield. And you're wanting me to do this. Oh, the Ark of the Covenant is still being used in battle even after that point. That's important to note, because the one time that Israel brings the ark into battle and it backfires on them in 1 Samuel chapter 4, their problem isn't the fact that they brought the ark to the battlefield. Their problem is what their whole thinking is, their motives. Oh, we lost, so it's clearly because we didn't have the magic talisman on the field. That wasn't your problem, Israel. Your problem was that you have a serious relationship break with the Lord, and bringing the ark to the battlefield isn't going to make the Lord happy with you. He's just going to fight against you at that point. And God was present at that battle, but not to help them. He was against them in that instance. When's the last time the ark was moved? Before this point, when was the last time the Ark of the Covenant was moved? That's right. The Philistines sent it back. Because when the Philistines captured the ark in 1 Samuel 4, they brought it to their cities. And, it brought plagues on all the cities that it went to. Huh? Yeah, it didn't work out so well for them. It defeated their gods and made them look bad. And, it caused all sorts of problems in their cities. And eventually they decided to send it back. How did they send it back? Yeah, they put it on an ox cart and sent it back. And the cows drove it back to Israel of their own free will. Here you'll notice in verse 3, they placed the ark of God on a new cart that they might bring it from the house of Abinadab. They're using the same methods to move the ark that it was moved with last time when the Philistines moved it. Now, there's a difference. What's the difference? Philistines don't know any better. Israel should have known better. Now, moving the ark is a dangerous enterprise. What else happened the last time the ark was moved? Anybody remember? It got to Beth Shemesh, and what did they do at Beth Shemesh?
Oh,
Yeah, they decided to look into the ark. We don't know why, but, of course, how does the Lord feel about when people touch His ark and look inside it? And a lot of people died that day. In 1 Samuel 1 Samuel 6, excuse me. There's kind of a chapter division issue with 6 and 7. Moving the ark's a dangerous enterprise. Don't touch it. You might put a sign up, high voltage. Don't touch it or you will die. Don't look at it or you will die. And whenever that happened at Beth Shemesh, they sent the ark to the house of Abinadab, and it stayed there. And it stayed there the whole time that Saul was king. I guess it probably got brought to a battlefield once or twice, but it stayed in the house of Abinadab for a long time. But David, now that he's captured Jerusalem, is determined to bring the ark to this city. There's kind of a... and this is a huge event for the reign of David. I think we need to appreciate that. Chapter 5 has a bunch of military victories. And chapter 6 is in some ways more important. Because Israel's not sustained by military might. They're sustained by God's presence among them. The issue is not who is against us, who is fighting for us. The issue is who is among us. So, now we look here, David, he's celebrating the occasion, music and instruments and things like that. And then we have a little disruption in the festivities in verses 6 through 11. Somebody read those.
John's threshing floor, put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, and knocked it. The anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there with an arrow. He died there by the ark of God. David became angry with outbreak against Uzzah. He called the name of the place Perez Uzzah unto this day. David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of God of the Lord come to me? David would not move the ark of the Lord. David took it aside in the house of Obed.
Verse 11.
The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed the Gittite 3 months. Blessed Obed.
Okay. So Uzzah touches the ark and dies. And David fears. He clearly never saw Raiders of the Lost Ark. I'm just saying. Alright, why does Uzzah touch the ark? It was about to fall, Oxen stumbled. The Lord put him to death for his irreverence. I noticed that Mark's version said error, There's an issue there. And, it's hard to read into Uzzah's motives exactly because the Bible doesn't tell us. It's one of those things that you're kind of left to wonder about a little bit. The Hebrew term here for error or irreverence, or I don't know, did anybody have a translation other than error or irreverence in verse 7? I'm just curious. Rashness, okay. Yeah, it's a really weird word in Hebrew. We don't know actually what it means because this is the only place it appears in the Old Testament. That's always fun, right? The Septuagint just omits it altogether, and the Dead Sea Scrolls rewords it to be parallel with the account in Chronicles. 1 Chronicles 13 is a lot clearer. 1 Chronicles 13 and verse 10 says, verse 10, I've got the wrong reference here. Oh no, I've got the wrong book. I'm reading 2 Chronicles. There's my problem. 1 Chronicles 13, verse 10, the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, so he struck him down because he put his hand out to the ark. He died there before God. That's the reason. Well, what's so bad about touching the ark? God told him not to. Where did God say not to do that? He told them how to. That's true. Where did he say that? Actually, in Numbers, in that section of Numbers that nobody ever reads, that's probably the problem. Nobody read Numbers back then either. This is where it goes really wrong. Numbers chapter 4 in verse 15 says,
When Aaron and his sons had finished covering the holy objects and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, when the camp is to set out, after that the sons of Kohath shall come in to carry them, so they will not touch the holy objects and die. These are the things in the tent of meeting which the sons of Kohath are to carry. Now, if the Kohathites aren't allowed to touch it, Uzzah's not allowed to touch it either. You touch it, you die. I mean, the thing should have been covered up anyway. But it wasn't. Then, of course, it gets even better. In verses 19 and 20, and do this that they will may live and not die when they approach the most holy objects. Aaron and his sons shall go in and assign each of them to his work and to his load, but they shall not go in to see the holy objects, even for a moment, or they'd die. We think touching the ark is bad. The law actually forbids even looking at it in Numbers chapter 4. In Numbers chapter 7, which is by far the longest and most repetitive chapter in the whole Bible, there's this reference at the very beginning of it. Numbers chapter 7. In number 7 describes a bunch of gifts that they're giving, and they give special carts to move stuff around in the various divisions of the Levites. But in verse 9, it says he did not give any carts to the sons of Kohath, because theirs was the service of the holy objects which they carried on the shoulder. Carried on the shoulder. Now that, unless I'm mistaken, that's actually the only reference in the law to carrying stuff on the shoulder, carrying the ark on the shoulder. And it's in that chapter of Numbers that nobody ever reads. Does God expect you to read this part of the Bible? He expected Israel to. And Chronicles is a little more detailed. The parallel account in Chronicles, in 1 Chronicles 13 and 15, it breaks it apart. We learn some additional information about why Uzzah died. Samuel doesn't stress the ox cart carrying distinction so much, but Chronicles does. In 1 Chronicles chapter 15, it says that because you did not carry it at the first, the Lord our God made an outburst on us, for we did not seek him according to the ordinance. So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord God of Israel. The sons of the Levites carried the ark of God on their shoulders, and the poles thereon, as Moses had commanded according to the word of the Lord. The one thing that David says in that passage is kind of interesting. He doesn't say the Lord made an outburst on Uzzah. He said he made an outburst on us. Uzzah's punishment isn't just against one man. It's against the whole community. Representative community punishment. You want to know why Uzzah died? Because he touched the ark? Yeah. But also because of a wholesale failure of the nation to read the law. Is God being fair? Of course, all right. He's being just. He's being just, fair. Some people, this is one of those stories that, some people might use this story as an opportunity to blaspheme and criticize God and say, oh, he's just being so unfair about all of this. Why does God care so much? Why is he afraid of people getting fingerprints on his furniture or whatnot? In a roundabout way, this story is an apologetic for God. Because human beings would never invent a God that does stuff like this. Humans are way too sensitive about it. This gives people too much of an upset stomach. Humans would not invent this story. But the truth is, God's just following his own rules. Don't touch the ark. He's very clear. No touching, no looking, no carting. Don't do those things. Contact with the ark ensures death. And if they had just bothered to read that section of Numbers, they probably would have been a little more careful. God cares about what people do with his furniture. And that's true in the physical sense, how much more in the spiritual sense, does God want people coming into his house and rearranging his furniture without his say-so? No. And yet people do that with the Lord's people even today, don't they? And we got to be careful not to do that ourselves. All right, so Uzzah dies. And how does David react? He's afraid. He's angry, yes. Anger and fear. Anger because the Lord had made a breakthrough. There's a nice little word play here, and it doesn't come across in translation. The word for breakthrough is paratz. In Genesis 38, when Judah's son Perez is born, he's a breech birth. So they name him Breech, Peretz. Well, here, it's a breakthrough, or the Lord makes a breakthrough against Uzzah. He calls it Peretz Uzzah. In the previous chapter, it was Baal Peretzim, the master of breakthrough. Here, now, the Lord's making breakthroughs against them. It's a little more sobering. Just like when the Israelites were struck down before the ark at Kiryat Jearim, David also reacts with fear. And the ark doesn't come to Jerusalem. Where does it go instead? It goes to Obed-Edom. What is unusual about Obed-Edom? Who was he? A Gittite. What was a Gittite? What? A citizen of Gath. Okay. And where was Gath? What kind of city was Gath? It was a Philistine city. Anybody else? Yeah. Obed-Edom was a Gittite, which makes him a Philistine. And they send the ark to his house. And he was blessed. Anyway, we're supposed to see that that's a... Wait a second. What happened the last time we sent the ark to the Philistines? I mean... I think we sometimes miss it. I've missed it for years because of translation, but Gittites were inhabitants of Gath. We do continue to see who's in control. It's not that God... The reason the ark punished the Philistines isn't because God hates the Philistines. That's not the issue. The issue is... in chapter 5, God broke through against the Philistines and blessed Israel. Chapter 6, God breaks through against an Israelite and blesses a Philistine. God's care is not limited to Israel. Even the Philistines, even the pagans, even the outsiders can be blessed by God's presence. Now there are other references in Chronicles. Obed-Edom apparently eventually became one of the gatekeepers of the temple, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. But that's one thing. The Lord is not... He's not just throwing temper tantrums at everybody he meets. He blesses this guy, this foreigner. Well, why? Well, because he's the custodian of the ark. Because apparently he cared for the ark in a way that they weren't caring for it when they were moving it. Now, we move on from there. Anybody have any comments or questions up to this point? All right. There's a right and a wrong way to approach God. Now, let's move into verse 12. Let's read verses 12 through 19. We may not finish chapter 6 today, but somebody read verses 12 through 19. All right. David, I'll just ask this. How would we characterize David's behavior, first of all, in these verses? What would you say about him?
Glad.
He was glad. He was zealous. Don. Well, yeah, we'll deal with Michael in a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, well, there's evidence that she's misstating what he's doing if you look at the parallel account in Chronicles. Yeah, that's true. David says what he was doing as well, and what he is doing in terms of humbling himself before the maids of Israel and all of his motives and whatnot. It's interesting to think about this because are zeal and reverence incompatible with each other? No! And sometimes I wonder if the religious world seems to think that for some reason. They're not incompatible. When someone expresses joy and passion for serving the Lord, it's not appropriate for a less expressive Christian to look down their nose at that, and criticize that, and complain about that. That's not appropriate. And vice versa. People relate to the Lord in certain ways, as long as we stay within the bounds of the Scriptures, of course. That's the main point that needs to be made in all of this. But zeal is not unscriptural. David's behavior here is not wrong. Some people have tried to make David's behavior here wrong. Very creative attempts to do so. But it's not. Because if it is, where's the Lord's reaction to it? Where's the Lord's condemnation? And the Lord clearly just said what he thought of Uzzah. But not so much with David. David, the Lord has a much more favorable impression of David when we get to chapter 7. Yes? Oh, brother. It isn't like reverence is mandatory and joy is optional. And again, I'm not going to try to judge anybody or paint any pictures of anybody, but it's like reverence and joy go hand in hand with each other. Sometimes you see Christians, they sit through the singing and have these frowns on their face, like they hate what's going on. Like, oh, I can't believe we're worshiping God. Oh, he led an extra song. How terrible he must be for, we don't want to accidentally spend too much time worshiping. That would be horrible. Where does that mentality come from? It doesn't come from the Word. It doesn't come from a reverence for God. I can say that with pretty well certainty. It doesn't come from loving God too much. There's no such thing as loving God too much. How in the world did we ever get there? Well, the problem is, when people, of course, there are two wrong ways to go about it. On the one hand, people can create an image of God that isn't really God and, try to, worship that God instead and get all excited about that God that they've crafted in their own image. But the opposite extreme is as good as well, is to know God for who He is and yet not somehow be moved to sheer awe and reverence and joy for being in His presence. How is it that people react in the presence of God? They just kind of sit there and go, oh, well, that's interesting. Is that how Isaiah acted? He fell, he was so terrified. He realized that by comparison to him, I am a sinful man. I am a person of unclean lips. I dwell among a people of unclean lips. Every time that God appears to anybody, people fall on their faces. Physical prostration is something that is very, very lost on our culture. And, again, I'm not going to try to say, that we should be trying to adopt ancient cultures into our system. That's not the point. But the point is that think a little bit about how we approach God and whether or not perhaps we are being a little too hands-off-ish, cold even. That's just thoughts to consider. Keith, you had something. Absolutely. No, I would agree with that. Yeah. That's true. Every culture is different. We don't want to make the mistake of confusing what God has said for the culture of the people that He was speaking to. Because some people make that mistake and they confuse the two things together, like, well, Jesus wore sandals, so I should wear sandals. I waited until Don was out to say that, by the way. No, but in reality, trying to recreate a culture is not what we're trying to do. What we are trying to do, though, is recreate or rather restore our hearts to our Father, who made us and who restored us and who brought us into a relationship with Christ. And just, I guess, consider that, reflect on that, and think about it a little bit. I'm going to bring the class to a close because we're out of time. We will try to finish up chapter 6 and some of the details in that. I guess we'll need to pick up with question 7 next time. So thank you all for your attention and your comments, and I hope that this was encouraging and edifying.